The skies over the Middle East went quiet in a way they hadn't in years. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of something being taken away. In a single operation, Iran didn't just fire a missile, it didn't just down an aircraft. According to multiple defense analysts and intelligence community insiders, what Iran executed was something far more precise, far more calculated, and far more devastating to American strategic interests than any single military strike in recent memory. It wasn't an act of war in the traditional sense, it was an act of blinding. For decades, the United States has maintained what military strategists call persistent surveillance over the Middle East, a layered, overlapping web of reconnaissance assets that includes high-altitude drones, satellite relay stations, signals intelligence platforms, and human intelligence networks that feed real-time data to commanders across the region. This infrastructure is not just an advantage. It is the foundation upon which every American military decision in the region is built. Without it, American forces don't just lose an edge, they lose their sight. What Iran targeted was not incidental. Intelligence assessments now suggest the strike was the culmination of years of patient mapping. Iran methodically identifying, tracking, and cataloging every American surveillance asset operating in or near its airspace. What was destroyed was not simply hardware. What was destroyed was institutional knowledge, operational continuity, and the invisible architecture of American dominance over one of the most volatile regions on the planet. The immediate ripple effects were felt within hours. At command centers across the Gulf, screens went dark. Data feeds that had streamed continuously for years simply stopped. Officers who had relied on near-perfect situational awareness found themselves operating in a fog that modern American military doctrine had spent billions of dollars making impossible. But this is not just a story about military technology. This is a story about power, about the terrifying speed at which strategic advantage can be reversed, and about what happens when a nation that has spent 20 years studying its adversary finally decides to act on everything it has learned. This is also a story about what comes next, because the implications of what Iran has done extend far beyond the wreckage of whatever was shot out of that sky. They extend into the diplomatic corridors of Washington, the war rooms of Tel Aviv, the strategic calculations of Beijing, and the energy markets that determine the price every single person watching this video pays to fill their tank. We are going to walk through all of it: the history, the event itself, the intelligence, the analysis, and the two futures that are now in play. If you want to understand what just happened and why it matters more than almost anything you've seen in the past decade, stay with us. And if you're new here, now is the time to subscribe, because this story is not over. It is just beginning. To understand what Iran just did, you have to understand what America built. And to understand what America built, you have to go back, why not years, but decades. The story begins in the aftermath of the 1979 Islamic Revolution, when Ayatollah Khomeini's government seized power in Tehran and American diplomats were taken hostage for 444 days, the United States intelligence community underwent a quiet, painful reckoning. It had been caught almost completely off guard by the speed and totality of the Shah's collapse. The CIA had assets in Iran, it had relationships, it had networks, and it lost almost all of them virtually overnight. That failure was never forgotten. Over the following decades, the United States rebuilt its intelligence posture in the Middle East with a singular obsession: never be blind again. The investment was staggering. Signals intelligence infrastructure was embedded across friendly Gulf states. Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates became not just military partners, but nodes in an enormous surveillance architecture. Reconnaissance aircraft flew continuous rotations, and when drone technology matured in the early 2000s, the Middle East became the testing ground for the most sophisticated unmanned surveillance platforms ever developed. The RQ-4 Global Hawk, the MQ-9 Reaper, the RQ-170 Sentinel. These were not just aircraft. They were flying intelligence stations capable of loitering for hours at extreme altitudes, vacuuming up electronic signals, photographing infrastructure, and feeding live video to analysts thousands of miles away. Each one represented hundreds of millions of dollars in investment. Each one was a linchpin in a system designed to give American commanders total awareness of everything moving on the ground, in the air, and at sea across an area spanning millions of square kilometers. Iran watched all of it. This is the part of the story that Western analysts were slow to fully appreciate. While Washington celebrated its technological dominance, Tehran was conducting its own long game. Iranian engineers reverse-engineered captured drone components. Iranian electronic warfare units studied American transmission frequencies. Iranian intelligence mapped flight patterns, identified relay stations, and built a comprehensive picture of exactly how America's surveillance web was structured, and more importantly, where its seams were. The turning point came in 2011 when Iran captured an RQ-170 Sentinel drone largely intact after it went down near Kashmir in northeastern Iran. American officials claimed it had malfunctioned. Iranian officials claimed they had brought it down through a sophisticated GPS spoofing operation. Whatever the truth, the message was unmistakable. Iran was no longer simply a passive subject of American surveillance. It was an active participant in the intelligence contest. From that moment forward, the trajectory was set. In 2019, Iran shot down an American RQ-4 Global Hawk over what it claimed was Iranian territorial airspace, a strike that brought the two countries closer to open conflict than at any point since the hostage crisis. The Trump administration prepared retaliatory strikes and then famously pulled back with 10 minutes to spare. That decision, that hesitation, was registered in Tehran not as restraint, but as a data point. In January 2020, the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani reshuffled the entire regional intelligence picture. Iran's retaliatory missile strikes on al-Assad air base in Iraq wounded over 100 American service members and demonstrated something that analysts had long theorized but never fully seen confirmed. Iran's ballistic missile program had achieved a level of precision that made large fixed American installations genuinely vulnerable. The years that followed were a slow, methodical escalation. Iran-backed proxy forces across Iraq, Syria, and Yemen probed American defenses with increasing sophistication. Drone swarms tested air defense response times. Cyber operations targeted communications infrastructure. And all the while, Iran's intelligence apparatus continued its patient work, identifying, mapping, cataloging. By the time the strike that defines this story was executed, Iran wasn't improvising. It was completing a project it had been working on for the better part of a generation. What happened next wasn't an attack, it was a conclusion. The details of what happened emerged slowly, the way they always do when something genuinely significant occurs, in fragments, in contradictions, in the careful language of officials who know more than they are saying. What is confirmed is this: at some point in the operational window, one or more American surveillance assets operating in or near the broader Iranian sphere of influence were struck, disabled, or destroyed in a manner that was neither accidental nor isolated. The strike, gain or series of strikes, was coordinated. It was sequenced. And according to multiple defense officials speaking on background to major international outlets, it achieved something that American planners had long considered a catastrophic but low probability scenario: simultaneous degradation of overlapping surveillance layers across a defined geographic zone. In plain language, Iran didn't just hit one asset, it hit the system. Here is what the sequencing appears to have looked like, based on available open-source intelligence, satellite imagery analysis, and statements from regional defense officials. First came the electronic warfare component. In the hours before any physical strike, American signals intelligence platforms began registering anomalies, interference patterns consistent with sophisticated jamming operations targeting GPS navigation and encrypted data link frequencies. This was not crude jamming. This was precise, targeted disruption designed to degrade specific communication channels without triggering the full spectrum of American electronic countermeasures. Iran had apparently studied exactly which frequencies to hit and exactly how hard to hit them without crossing the threshold that would have triggered an immediate kinetic response. Then came the kinetic phase. At least one high-value reconnaissance platform, and potentially more, was engaged by what analysts believe was a combination of surface-to-air missile systems and precision drone interdiction. The targeting solutions used were not consistent with opportunistic engagement. They were consistent with pre-planned, rehearsed strike packages executed against assets whose flight patterns had been studied and predicted in advance. The wreckage, what little has been confirmed, tells its own story. Iran's account of events is characteristically maximalist. State media framed the operation as a decisive blow against American aggression, a defensive action taken in response to what Tehran described as systematic violations of Iranian sovereignty through persistent aerial surveillance. Iranian military officials claimed the strike was carried out entirely within the bounds of international law, targeting assets operating in contested or Iranian-controlled airspace. They released what they described as evidence of the platform's incursion into restricted zones, imagery and telemetry data whose authenticity Western analysts have neither fully confirmed nor fully refuted. America's account has been notably more restrained. Official Pentagon statements acknowledge the loss of assets without specifying their nature, number, or the precise circumstances of their destruction. This restraint is itself informative. When the United States loses a surveillance drone to a technical malfunction, it says so clearly. When it loses assets in a manner that reveals something operationally sensitive about how those assets were deployed, it goes quiet. The silence here has been loud. The gap between these two narratives is where the most important questions live. Was Iran operating within its legal rights under international airspace law, or was this an unprovoked strike on assets operating in international airspace, as American officials have implied? The answer matters enormously, not just legally, but strategically, because it determines whether this event constitutes an act of war under the frameworks that govern American military response options. What the evidence suggests, taken in aggregate, is something more complicated than either side's official position. The surveillance assets in question were almost certainly operating in a gray zone, not clearly inside Iranian airspace, not clearly outside it, in precisely the kind of ambiguous corridor that both sides have tacitly exploited for years. America to collect intelligence, Iran to preserve the option of engagement without triggering a full military confrontation. Iran chose to exercise that option, and it did so in a way that maximized operational impact while minimizing the legal and diplomatic clarity that would have forced an immediate American military response. That calculation, precise, patient, and devastatingly effective, is the most important thing to understand about what happened. This was not a mistake. It was not an escalation born of panic or miscalculation. Every indicator points to a deliberate, carefully engineered operation designed to achieve a specific strategic outcome: the degradation of American situational awareness at a moment of maximum geopolitical leverage. The question that every analyst in Washington, Tel Aviv, Riyadh, and Brussels is now asking is the same one we need to sit with before moving forward. What does Iran know that we don't about what it just made possible? There is a concept in military strategy called the reconnaissance strike complex. It is the idea that modern warfare is not won by the side with the most soldiers or the most missiles. It is won by the side that can see the battlefield most clearly and translate that vision into action most quickly. The United States built the most sophisticated reconnaissance strike complex in human history, and Iran just put a hole in it. To understand the full weight of what that means, you have to understand what these surveillance assets actually do, not in the abstract, but in the concrete operational reality of the Middle East in 2024. Start with geography. The Middle East is not a single theater. It is a layered, interconnected web of overlapping crises, proxy conflicts, and strategic choke points spread across an area roughly the size of the continental United States. At any given moment, American commanders are tracking Iranian-backed militia movements in Iraq and Syria, monitoring Houthi missile and drone launch sites in Yemen, watching Iranian naval activity in the Strait of Hormuz, assessing Hezbollah force positioning in southern Lebanon, and maintaining awareness of Iranian ballistic missile battery locations across the Iranian plateau. Every one of these missions depends on persistent, reliable surveillance data. The assets Iran targeted were not peripheral to this mission. They were central to it. High-altitude reconnaissance platforms operating over the region provide something that satellite coverage alone cannot: continuous real-time, weather-independent observation of specific geographic zones. Satellites pass overhead on predictable orbital schedules. Experienced adversaries know those schedules and plan accordingly, moving sensitive equipment, concealing launch preparations, and timing operations to fall between satellite windows. Persistent drone surveillance eliminates that vulnerability. It closes the gaps. It makes the battlefield, in theory, transparent. Without it, those gaps reopen. And Iran knows exactly where they are. Consider the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes every single day. American naval operations in the Gulf depend on continuous surveillance of Iranian fast boat formations, submarine activity, and mining operations. The degradation of aerial surveillance assets in this corridor does not just create an intelligence gap. It creates a tactical vulnerability that Iranian naval commanders can exploit in ways that were not possible 72 hours ago. Consider the Houthi threat in Yemen. American and allied naval vessels in the Red Sea have been operating under sustained drone and missile attack for months. The targeting solutions used to intercept Houthi projectiles depend in part on early warning data fed from regional surveillance platforms. Degrade those platforms and you don't just lose intelligence, you compress the response timeline for naval air defense systems in ways that could, under the wrong circumstances, prove fatal. Consider Hezbollah in Lebanon. Israeli and American planners have maintained extraordinarily detailed intelligence pictures of Hezbollah's weapons storage facilities, command nodes, and tunnel infrastructure. Intelligence built over years of persistent aerial surveillance. That picture is now to some degree out of date. And in the compressed timeframes of modern conflict, out of date means dangerous. Now zoom out further. The strategic importance of what Iran destroyed extends beyond any single theater or any single adversary. American surveillance infrastructure in the Middle East does not only watch Iran, it watches everyone. It monitors Russian naval movements through the eastern Mediterranean. It tracks Chinese commercial and intelligence vessels operating in the Gulf of Oman. It provides early warning data that feeds into the broader global intelligence architecture shared with NATO allies, with Israel, with Gulf partners, and with the Five Eyes intelligence community. When Iran degraded American surveillance capacity in the region, it didn't just hand itself an advantage. It handed every adversary of American power a gift, whether they asked for it or not. There is also an operational dimension that has received insufficient attention in mainstream coverage. The assets destroyed or disabled were not simply sensors. They were nodes in a networked system. Intelligence architecture is not a collection of independent platforms. It is an integrated web where each component both contributes data and enables the functioning of adjacent components. When you remove a node from that web, you don't just lose what that node was providing. You create cascading degradation effects that ripple through the entire system in ways that are difficult to predict and time-consuming to remediate. Military engineers call this single points of failure. Iran, it appears, had mapped them with extraordinary precision. Replacing what was lost is not simply a matter of deploying new hardware. Surveillance networks take months, sometimes years, to rebuild to full operational effectiveness. New platforms must be introduced, calibrated, and integrated. New flight patterns must be established and tested. New data relay protocols must be verified. And all of this must be done while operating in an environment where Iran has demonstrated it knows how to find and destroy exactly these kinds of assets. The deterrence equation has shifted. For years, the implicit logic of American surveillance dominance in the Middle East was this: we can see everything, and because we can see everything, we can respond to anything. That logic created a form of strategic stability. Adversaries who knew they were being watched knew that aggressive action would be detected, assessed, and answered. That logic is now under direct challenge, not shattered, but challenged. And in geopolitics, as in physics, the moment a force that was assumed to be constant is revealed to be variable, everything built on top of that assumption must be recalculated. In Washington's war rooms and intelligence fusion centers, that recalculation is happening right now, and the answers it is producing are not comfortable ones. When an event of this magnitude occurs, the first instinct of governments is to control the narrative. The first instinct of serious analysts is to ignore the narrative and look at the data. What the data is showing across intelligence assessments, think tank analyses, and the carefully worded statements of former senior officials paints a picture that is more alarming than anything currently appearing in official press releases. Begin with the intelligence community's own internal reckoning. According to assessments circulated among senior defense officials and reported by analysts with direct access to classified briefing summaries, the operation Iran executed demonstrated a level of operational sophistication that has forced a fundamental reassessment of Iranian electronic warfare capabilities. For years, the prevailing institutional view within American intelligence held that Iran's ability to target and destroy high-value American surveillance assets was real but manageable, a threat that could be mitigated through operational security protocols, redundant systems, and the sheer depth of American technological advantage. That view is now being revisited with considerable urgency. The specific concern is not simply that Iran succeeded, it is how Iran succeeded. Intelligence analysts note that the jamming signatures recorded in the lead-up to the kinetic phase of the operation were consistent with capabilities that Iran was not publicly known to possess at this level of refinement. The frequency targeting was too precise, the timing was too coordinated, the integration between electronic warfare and kinetic strike elements was too seamless. This does not happen by accident, and it does not happen without either indigenous development of significant sophistication or external technical assistance. The question of external assistance is one that analysts are treating with considerable seriousness. Experts at major international security institutes have pointed to a pattern of deepening technical cooperation between Iran, Russia, and China over the past several years that has received insufficient public attention. Russian electronic warfare doctrine, among the most sophisticated in the world, battle-tested in Ukraine and Syria, shares notable characteristics with what was observed in the lead-up to this operation. Chinese signals intelligence technology, elements of which have been transferred to Iran through channels that American sanctions have failed to fully interdict, may also have played a role. The precise architecture of what was used remains classified, but the fingerprints are visible to those who know where to look. Former NSA senior analyst and signals intelligence specialist John Schindler, writing in the aftermath of the event, noted that the operation bore the hallmarks of what Russian military planners call reflexive control, the art of shaping an adversary's decision-making environment by selectively degrading its information inputs rather than directly attacking its physical forces. In this framework, the goal is not destruction for its own sake. The goal is to create a specific cognitive state in the adversary's command structure: uncertainty, hesitation, and the paralysis that follows when commanders no longer trust the data they are receiving. Analysts warn that this cognitive dimension of the strike may ultimately prove more consequential than the physical damage itself. Think tanks with deep ties to the defense establishment have been particularly pointed in their assessments. The Institute for the Study of War, whose analysts have tracked Iranian military development with forensic precision for over a decade, published an assessment noting that Iran appears to have crossed a capability threshold that fundamentally alters the risk calculus for American surveillance operations across the entire region. The assessment noted specifically that the operation demonstrated Iran's ability to conduct what military theorists call counter-ISR operations, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance denial, at a scale and sophistication previously associated only with near-peer adversaries like Russia and China. That categorization carries enormous weight in Washington's strategic planning community. It means Iran is no longer being assessed through the framework of a regional military power with asymmetric capabilities. It is beginning to be assessed through the framework of a sophisticated state adversary capable of challenging American military dominance in ways that go beyond proxy warfare and missile barrages. Military analysts with operational backgrounds in the region have added a granular dimension to this assessment that the think tank community sometimes misses. Retired senior officers who spoke to defense publications in the days following the strike were unanimous on one point: the operational security discipline demonstrated by Iran in the lead-up to this event was extraordinary. There were no significant intelligence leaks. There was no observable increase in communications traffic that would have triggered preemptive American countermeasures. The preparation was conducted in a manner that suggests either a very small, tightly controlled planning cell or a level of confidence that American surveillance of Iranian military communications had itself been compromised. That second possibility is the one keeping people awake in Langley. Academic and policy experts focused on Iranian strategic culture have offered an additional layer of analysis that situates this event within the broader arc of Iranian grand strategy. Professor Vali Nasser, one of the foremost Western scholars of Iranian politics and foreign policy, has long argued that Iran's strategic patience is one of its most consistently underestimated attributes. Tehran does not respond to provocations immediately. It absorbs them, studies them, and responds at a time and place of its own choosing, maximizing impact and minimizing exposure. What we witnessed, these analysts argue, was not a reaction. It was a strategy reaching maturity. The convergence of these analytical perspectives from signals intelligence specialists, military analysts, think tank researchers, and academic experts points toward a conclusion that is difficult to escape. Iran did not stumble into a successful operation. Iran executed a sophisticated multi-domain strike against a carefully selected set of targets at a moment of deliberate strategic choosing. The capabilities it demonstrated were real, were refined, and did not emerge overnight. And the implications of those capabilities extend well beyond the immediate damage assessment. What America lost in the skies over the Middle East was not just hardware. According to the people whose professional lives are dedicated to understanding exactly these kinds of events, it was something considerably harder to replace. It was the assumption of invulnerability. But the other side has a point. And in a story this consequential, intellectual honesty demands that we sit with that point seriously, not as a courtesy and not as a rhetorical device, but because the alternative interpretation of these events carries genuine analytical weight that responsible observers cannot simply dismiss. Begin with the most fundamental challenge to the dominant narrative. There is a version of this story in which the United States is not the victim of a devastating strategic ambush, but rather the architect of a provocation that Iran responded to in a manner that was, by the standards of international law and the long history of this particular conflict, entirely predictable. This version does not absolve Iran of the use of force, but it situates that use of force within a context that the dominant Western framing has been conspicuously reluctant to examine. The surveillance assets that Iran targeted were not operating in a vacuum. They were operating in or near airspace that Iran has consistently, publicly, and formally designated as restricted, and whose violation it has consistently, publicly, and formally warned would be met with a response. The 2019 shoot-down of the RQ-4 Global Hawk was not an anomaly. It was a stated policy, executed once as a warning, and now executed again with greater effect. From Tehran's perspective, the question is not why Iran acted. The question is why anyone is surprised that it did. This argument finds support in corners of the international legal community that rarely receive prominent placement in American media coverage. Several international law scholars specializing in airspace sovereignty and the laws of armed conflict have noted that the legal status of persistent surveillance operations conducted by one state over or near the territory of another, particularly in the context of an undeclared but functionally ongoing conflict, is considerably more ambiguous than American official statements suggest. The United States does not formally acknowledge the full scope of its surveillance operations in the region. It therefore cannot fully invoke the legal protections it would need to characterize Iran's response as a clear violation of international norms. Tehran has been making this argument for years. Most Western audiences have never heard it stated seriously. There is also a strategic miscalculation argument that deserves careful consideration, one that cuts not against Iran, but against Washington. Several senior former American officials, speaking in forums where candor is more permissible than in public statements, have raised a question that rarely penetrates mainstream policy debate. Did the United States, through the sheer visibility and persistence of its surveillance operations, effectively dare Iran to act? Military strategists are familiar with the concept of provocation by presence, the idea that the sustained, aggressive deployment of intelligence assets in a contested environment is not a neutral act, it is a form of pressure. And pressure, applied indefinitely without diplomatic resolution, eventually produces a response. If that analysis is correct, and there are serious people who believe it is, then the story of what Iran destroyed is also the story of what American strategic overconfidence created. Former diplomat and Middle East policy veteran Chaz Freeman, one of the most consistently prescient critics of American regional strategy, has argued for years that Washington's reliance on technological dominance as a substitute for diplomatic engagement in its relationship with Iran has produced exactly the kind of strategic brittleness that this event has now exposed. Surveillance infrastructure, however sophisticated, is not a policy. It is a tool, and tools deployed in the absence of coherent strategy tend eventually to become liabilities. Consider also the propaganda dimension, because it would be analytically negligent to ignore it. Iran's state media coverage of this event has been maximalist, triumphalist, and carefully curated for domestic and regional consumption. Supreme Leader Khamenei's office framed the operation in explicitly ideological terms as evidence of divine favor and the inevitable decline of American power. This framing serves obvious domestic political purposes in a country where economic sanctions have produced genuine hardship and where the regime's legitimacy depends in part on its ability to demonstrate resistance to American pressure. The question serious analysts must ask is this: to what extent does Iran's public characterization of the event inflate its actual strategic significance for domestic consumption? Is it possible that the operational success, while real, has been amplified by Iranian state media on one end and by American defense establishment budget cycle incentives on the other into something larger than it actually was? This is not a comfortable question to ask, but it is a necessary one. There are defense analysts, a minority, but a credible one, who argue that American surveillance redundancy in the region is deeper than public assessments suggest, that the loss of specific platforms, while operationally significant, does not constitute the kind of systemic, unrecoverable degradation that the most alarming analyses imply, that the United States has backup systems alternative collection methods, and allied intelligence sharing arrangements that partially compensate for what was lost in ways that neither side has an incentive to publicly acknowledge. These analysts are not dismissing the event. They are calibrating it. And calibration in intelligence analysis is not weakness. It is discipline. There is one final alternative interpretation that sits uncomfortably at the intersection of strategy and psychology, and it may be the most important one of all. What if Iran's primary objective was never the physical destruction of American surveillance assets? What if the physical strike was the means, and the true objective was something less tangible but far more valuable? The demonstration to every actor in the region and beyond that American technological dominance is neither absolute nor permanent. In that reading, the actual damage is almost secondary. What Iran was selling to Hezbollah, to the Houthis, to Iraqi militias, to Russia, to China, and to every government currently calculating how much American power it can afford to challenge was a proof of concept. And proof of concept, once delivered, cannot be undelivered. That possibility that the real target was not a platform but a perception may be the interpretation that deserves the most serious attention of all. There is a tendency, when covering events of this kind, to keep the analysis at altitude, to speak in the language of strategic doctrine and geopolitical frameworks in ways that feel important but distant. This section will not do that, because what happened in the skies over the Middle East is not an abstraction. It is an event with consequences that will reach into the daily lives of ordinary people in ways that are already beginning to materialize, and will continue to do so in the months ahead. Start with the most immediate and universally felt consequence: energy. The Middle East sits atop approximately 50% of the world's proven oil reserves. The Strait of Hormuz, whose security is now measurably more complicated than it was before this operation, handles the transit of roughly 17 million barrels of oil per day. That number is not a statistic. It is the metabolic rate of the global economy. Every percentage point of disruption to that flow translates, within days, into price movements at refineries, at wholesale fuel markets, and ultimately at the pump outside your local gas station. Energy markets registered the implications of this event almost immediately. Oil futures moved sharply in the hours following the first confirmed reports. Analysts at major trading houses and investment banks revised their price forecasts upward, not because supply had already been disrupted, but because the risk premium attached to Middle Eastern supply had increased in a fundamental and not easily reversible way. Risk premium is the price the market charges for uncertainty, and Iran just produced a significant quantity of new uncertainty. If sustained disruption to Gulf energy flows materializes through Iranian naval interdiction, Houthi escalation enabled by degraded American surveillance, or direct conflict involving Gulf state infrastructure, and the economic modeling is sobering. Oil prices at levels not seen since the post-pandemic supply shock, inflation in energy-intensive economies, reignited at precisely the moment that central banks in the United States and Europe were beginning to believe they had it under control. Heating costs, transportation costs, manufacturing costs, every sector of the global economy that runs on fossil fuels, which is to say, every sector of the global economy absorbs the shock. For the viewer watching this in the United States, that means gasoline prices. It means utility bills. It means the price of every good that moves on a truck, which is to say the price of nearly everything. For viewers in Europe, the exposure is even more acute. European economies that spent 2022 in energy crisis following Russia's invasion of Ukraine have rebuilt their supply chains with significant dependence on Middle Eastern liquefied natural gas. A sustained disruption to that supply does not produce discomfort. It produces a genuine economic emergency in countries that are already operating with razor-thin fiscal margins. Move now to the military consequences, because they are equally far-reaching. The degradation of American surveillance capacity in the region does not occur in a static environment. It occurs in an environment where multiple active conflicts are already underway. The Houthi campaign against Red Sea shipping has not ended. Israeli military operations in Gaza and the broader northern front involving Hezbollah have not ended. Iranian-backed militia activity against American forces in Iraq and Syria has not ended. Every one of these conflicts is now being prosecuted in an environment where American situational awareness is measurably reduced. The practical military consequence is pressure to replace what was lost, and pressure on the systems and personnel tasked with operating in a more uncertain environment. American naval commanders in the Gulf are already operating under heightened threat conditions. The window between detecting an incoming threat and responding to it has compressed. In military operations, compressed timelines produce errors. Errors in environments with live weapons produce casualties. There is also a deterrence consequence that extends well beyond the immediate region. NATO's collective defense planning assumes a baseline of American intelligence dominance that has just been partially and publicly challenged. Alliance partners in Eastern Europe watching Russian behavior, partners in the Pacific watching Chinese naval expansion, partners in the Gulf watching Iranian proxy networks, all of them are recalibrating their own risk assessments based on what they just witnessed. American security guarantees are only as credible as the power that underwrites them. When that power is seen to be vulnerable in ways it was not previously understood to be, the credibility of those guarantees is affected, not destroyed, but affected. The geopolitical consequences radiate outward with particular intensity toward three capitals: Beijing, Moscow, and Jerusalem. For Beijing, this event is a data point of extraordinary value. China's military planners have spent years developing strategies for degrading American surveillance and communications infrastructure in the Pacific, the so-called anti-access area denial doctrine. What Iran just demonstrated in the Middle East is a real-world proof of concept for exactly the kind of operation Chinese strategists have been theorizing about in the context of a potential Taiwan contingency. The specific techniques, the sequencing, the integration of electronic warfare and kinetic strike, all of it will be studied with intense interest in Beijing's military academies and strategic planning offices. For Moscow, the benefits are more immediate. Russia is engaged in an active war in Ukraine in which American intelligence support, including surveillance data, signals intelligence, and targeting assistance, has been a decisive factor in Ukrainian battlefield performance. Any event that forces Washington to redirect intelligence resources, reassess surveillance architectures, or absorb the political and operational consequences of a high-profile asset loss serves Russian strategic interests directly. Moscow did not need to fire a single shot to benefit from what Iran just did. For Jerusalem, the implications are perhaps the most visceral. Israel's security doctrine is built on the assumption of intelligence superiority, whereas the ability to see threats before they materialize and act on them with precision. That doctrine depends in part on American surveillance infrastructure that now has a visible gap in it. Israeli military planners are acutely aware that Hezbollah in Lebanon represents a missile arsenal estimated at over 150,000 projectiles, the precise locations, readiness states, and launch preparations of which have been monitored continuously through the very kind of assets that Iran has now demonstrated it can destroy. The viewer in Tel Aviv, in Beirut, in Riyadh, in Dubai, they are not watching an abstract geopolitical drama. They are watching the security architecture that has underwritten the relative stability of their region for the past 2 decades develop a crack that no one yet knows how to fully repair. And the viewer in Washington, London, Paris, and Berlin needs to understand this. The decisions made in the next 30 to 90 days in response to what Iran has done will shape the security and economic environment that every person in the Western world inhabits for years to come. This is not background noise. This is the main